We're going to be in Hebrews chapter 11. Last week we looked at Eyes of Faith, part 1, looking at verses 23 through 26, where we hear about Moses' birth, about what he chose to do when he grew up, and why he made the choice to abandon everything he had. And today we're going to look at the next steps of faith that God challenged Moses with. So, just to recap, God highlights in verse 23, when Moses was born, there was a step of faith, but it was by his parents. And God highlights that his parents impacted Moses' step of faith, or impacted Moses. He highlights his parents' step of faith and then he highlights what happened to Moses when he had grown up, that he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter and chose to suffer with the people of God rather than enjoy the short-lived pleasure of sin. We talked about the significance of what it meant to refuse to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, what that meant, what it looked like, what he would have had as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And then God says that because he considered the reproach of the Messiah to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. So, I have a question. How big is your God? How big is your God? What is your God big enough to do? As we look further at in the life of Moses, we're going to see a man who was pretty small, whose God was really big. As we read in verse 27, we find that he left Egypt behind, not being afraid of the king's anger. For Moses persevered as one who sees him who is invisible. Now, there were 2 times that Moses left Egypt, right? The first time was when the king was trying to kill him because he killed an Egyptian, and what he did was known. The second time was when he was taking the nation of Israel as they were being forced out after the death of every firstborn of every household in the entire land of Egypt. Now, this particular passage says that when he left Egypt behind, not being afraid of the king's anger. Now, this is interesting because in Genesis, if you look back with me here, in Exodus chapter 2, in verse 11, we read, "Years later, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people and observed their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. Looking all around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, 'Why are you attacking your brother?' 'Who made you a leader and judge over us?' the man replied. 'Are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses became afraid and thought, 'What I did is certainly known.' When Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian and sat down by a well." Now, there's an interesting little note here because in Exodus, and Moses' first exit from Egypt, it says that he was afraid. In Hebrews, it says he was not afraid of the Pharaoh's anger. So I have to ask you a question. Which passage is right? Both. But how do we know both passages are right? Because this is where it's easy to get confused. When you're looking at Scripture and you see one passage says he's afraid, and the other passage says he's not afraid. But see, where the confusion comes in is not paying close enough attention to what the passage is saying. Because in Exodus, what does it say that he was afraid of? that the murder was known. He was afraid because the murder was known. That's what God says the fear was involving. So in Hebrews 11, when it says he wasn't afraid of the Pharaoh's anger, there's different things to be afraid of. See, he was afraid because he was found out. He thought he had hid it and that it wouldn't get found out, that the one person whose life had been spared would keep it quiet. Didn't happen that way. However, Scripture says he wasn't afraid of Pharaoh's anger. So then why did he leave? It's because he had chosen to reject all of the wealth and power and authority that he had been adopted into. He had chosen to reject that, and he could have gone back. He could have gone back to that wealth and power and authority and influence, and his life wouldn't have been in danger. But he chose to reject it. He didn't want it. So he made a choice that I'm going to leave this behind. If I can't have one or the other, I'm going to choose option C, and I'm going to leave. But it wasn't because of the king's anger that he left. Because he persevered as one who sees him who is invisible. You see, Moses had already made a choice. And how does God describe that? And he considered the reproach because of the Messiah to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. He had already made a choice that the Messiah was more valuable to him than everything he had grown up with. So when it came down to choosing whether to go back and save his life or to leave, he said, I'm not going back. I've already chosen the Messiah. And it's important to note that Moses had the option. As a matter of fact, it says previously in chapter 11, when it talks about our fathers of the faith, God says that they had the option of turning back. Oh, I turned too many pages. No wonder I couldn't find the verse like that. It's not there. There it is. He says in verse 15 of chapter 11 of Hebrews, if they were thinking about where they came from, they would have had an opportunity to return. But they now desire a better place, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. So Moses wasn't going back because he had already determined that the Messiah was of greater wealth than all the treasures of Egypt, which, by the way, he had access to. He had access to all the treasures of Egypt, the greatest nation in the world at this time. Moses had access to all of that. He said, the Messiah is more valuable to me. He'd already made that choice. And then God skips a long time here in the land of Midian, skips over Moses coming back, skips over the burning bush, and says, by faith he instituted the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch the Israelites. Here is this little man that God picked to use because this man picked God over owning everything that could have been owned in the known world. He picked God over it. He said, God, you're more valuable. The Messiah is more valuable. Your promises are more valuable. I'm choosing you. So God picked this man. And let's take a review of what happened. About the only good thing that happened to Moses in the desert was he got married and had children. Besides that, he served his father-in-law and had comparatively nothing to where he had come from. And we all know the burning bush story, right? God comes to Moses in a burning bush. Fantastic story, wonderful story. And what happens when Moses gets to Egypt and tells the leaders of Israel that God, this awesome God that he chose way before in his life, that he said, you're more valuable than all the treasures of Egypt. This God has come to me, and he's going to take us all out of here. And he's told me to lead you out of here. How did that conversation go? So let's see here. So verse 29 of Exodus 4, it says, Then Moses and Aaron went and assembled all the elders of the Israelites. Aaron repeated everything the Lord had said to Moses and performed the signs before the people. The people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had paid attention to them and that he had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped. So initially his response is great. You're going to be free. God's going to free you from your slavery. Yay! And then he goes and talks to Pharaoh. Remember what happened, right? Chapter 5 of Exodus, verse 2. But Pharaoh responded, Who is Yahweh, that I should obey him by letting Israel go? I do not know anything about Yahweh. And besides, I will not let Israel go. So then there's 10 plagues, right? The first plague is the water turned to blood. The second plague is frogs in Exodus 8. The third plague in Exodus 8 is gnats that cover the whole land. The fourth plague is flies that swarm everything. Now we move into chapter 9 of Exodus, the fifth plague, the death of livestock. God sends a disease, kills almost all, if not all, of the livestock. The sixth plague, now we're not attacking the land, because now the people all get boils. Everybody gets boils on their skin except the Israelites. Oh, by the way, the Israelites' flocks were not affected. In the seventh plague, hail, all the crops are destroyed. Eighth plague, locusts. Anything that wasn't destroyed by the hail, is eaten by locusts. And ninth plague is darkness. Imagine having no sun for days on end. And then we get to the 10th plague. And we all know what happens in the 10th plague. It's by far the most famous of the plagues. It's the final one, and everybody gets to go home after that. But what God highlights in Hebrews is not the significance of the plague, it's what Moses had to do in order for Israel to be saved through the plague. Because in every other one of these plagues, the Israelites were passive observers. They were not affected by most of them. They just got to see what happened around them in Egypt. They were not participating. And in fact, at this point, the leaders had already come back to Moses a couple times and said, Go, you've made our lives worse. It hasn't gotten better like you said. We don't know which God was talking to you, but you can get out of here. I'm paraphrasing. But they didn't want Moses at this point. Now Moses has to go back to these people that have had their workload tripled, their resources more than cut in half, and he's told them, there's one other thing that God's going to do, and you better pay attention to this. Talk about a friendly audience that he's walking into. That would be the equivalent of trying to take a conservative speech to the Democratic National Convention, right? You know going in, no one wants to listen to what you have to say, right? They've already determined they don't want you there. So if you take the stage, you're not going to get a positive result. However, God did give Moses some pretty helpful information on the front end. Because he said, in this plague, everyone is going to die. Every house is going to be affected. Every firstborn, male, female, and of the livestock, every firstborn is going to die. So God gave Moses some information that was going to grab people's attention, but Moses had to step into this awkward and uncomfortable and undesirable place to be, even to deliver the message. Let's look at at Exodus chapter 11. The Lord said to Moses, "I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will drive you out of here. Now announce to the people that both men and women should ask their neighbors for silver and gold jewelry." So God says he's going to let you go. By the way, ask for whatever you want. Specifically, ask for silver and gold. So Moses said, "This is what Yahweh says. About midnight I will go throughout Egypt, and every firstborn male in the land of Egypt will die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the servant girl who is behind the millstones, as well as every firstborn of the livestock. Then there will be a great cry of anguish through all the land of Egypt, such as never was before or ever will be again. But against all the Israelites, whether man or beast, not even a dog will snarl, so that you may know that Yahweh makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All these officials of yours will come down to me and bow before me, saying, 'Leave, you and all the people who follow you. After that, I will leave.' And he left Pharaoh's presence in fierce anger. The Lord said to Moses, 'Pharaoh will not listen to you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt.' Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart and would not let the Israelites go out of the land." And then we get to chapter 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, in the land of Egypt, this month is to be the beginning of months for you. It is the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, they must each select an animal of the flock according to their father's households, one animal per household. If the household is too small for a whole animal, that person and the neighbor nearest his house are to select one based on the combined number of people. You should apportion the animal according to what each person will eat. You must have an unblemished animal, a year-old male. You may take it from either the sheep or the goats. You are to keep it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembly of the community of Israel will slaughter the animals at twilight. Then they must take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses where they eat them. They are to eat the meat that night. They should eat it roasted over the fire along with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or cooked in boiling water, but only roasted over the fire, its head as well as its legs and inner organs. Do not let any of it remain until morning. You must burn up any part of it that does remain before morning. Here is how you must eat it. You must be dressed for travel, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You are to eat in a hurry. It is the Lord's Passover." Now that's a lot of instructions. That is not a simple thing to pass out. And imagine passing this out to a group of people that don't want you around, who are seriously doubting whether or not the God that they claim is the God that you claim, because there seems to be differing results. You claim that God's going to do one thing, but the opposite's happening. And now you have to go to them and give them these very unusual and detailed instructions. And you have to convince the entire nation that they must do this or they will die. I don't think I would have done it. Well, I'd like to think, oh yeah, I have a level of faith. Yes, I agree, but I know the end of the story. I know what happened in the end. I've read the story. I can look and say, yeah, that's great. Woohoo! I would do that. But put me in those shoes before the story is over. In the middle of it, when Pharaoh hates me, has threatened my life multiple times, when the Israelites hate me, they've asked me to leave, to never come back, to please don't do any more of what you're doing. I tell you what, my response would have been more like back at the burning bush. God, you really want me to go to those people again? Haven't you seen what all my attempts have done so far? I don't even know if they're going to let me in. I don't even know if I would be able to talk to them. They might throw me out. But God wasn't interested in somebody who could do the best job. God was interested in somebody who would listen to him. Because what happens here is God becomes big in everybody's eyes, and everybody recognizes that Moses was just a tool who obeyed. Moses did nothing. He was just a tool. He delivered a message. That's it. It was an unpopular message. It was an unpopular circumstance. He wasn't wanted. He wasn't liked. He wasn't appreciated. They wanted him to go back to the desert and never come back. But Moses delivered a message from the hand of God so that God could do what God does. God does amazing things. God is awesome. God is incredible. God is big. Nothing stands in God's way. Nothing stops God from what God wants to do. All God's interested in is obedient individuals who will deliver the message that he wants delivered in the process of what he's doing. So Moses was an obedient individual. But that's why he's mentioned by faith. And we all know what happened at the end of the story, that the Israelites plundered the Egyptians. The Egyptians were so overwhelmed with grief, they said, "Take whatever you want and leave." But now let's jump ahead a couple of chapters, right? What happens after they leave? Suddenly, Egypt realizes that its primary workforce has disappeared. This is a problem. We lost millions of people who were working for us for free. Boy, my kids don't want to work. How about yours? I don't want to work. How about you? You know, we should get these guys back. They were more valuable than we thought. Well, they don't have any weapons. We do. Let's go and bring our army and force them back into slave labor. So they go towards what we know as the Red Sea. I say that because I'm not exactly sure what it was called back in this time frame. But he says, so we have here that they go to the Red Sea, they're scared. Let's see, let's pick up. Verse 10 of chapter 14. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites, Exodus 14, verse 10. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up and saw the Egyptians coming after them. Then the Israelites were terrified and cried out to the Lord for help. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you took us to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Isn't this what we told you in Egypt?" What did they tell him? Here it comes. "Leave us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Okay, Moses, time to leave again. You know what happens when this has happened in my life, and it may have been what's happened in your life? Here's what happens. I go like this. God, I did my best. I did my best. There's nothing else I can do. So I'm done. And I'm done. I am truly done. I walk away. I have no intention of going back. I have no intention of doing anything. I'm done caring. I put out everything that I knew to put out. I stepped over every boundary that I could step over. I went and put myself out there at my own risk to help somebody. And you get that response of, get out of my face. I have no interest in what you're talking about. I don't want to hear it anymore. As a matter of fact, I told you previously not to tell me about this. Right? You heard words like that before in your life? Or something similar? Maybe yesterday? And what is it that what is your knee-jerk reaction? If you're like me, your knee-jerk reaction is this. Fine. Fine. But what does Moses say? This is what blows me away, and I think this is why Moses is referenced in Hebrews 11, because Moses' response in verse 13 is nothing short of an amazing statement about how big Moses' God is to him. Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. Stand firm and see the Lord's salvation He will provide for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You must be quiet." The idea of the quietness there is the idea of being still, of stopping, that you don't have to do anything. It's not the way that we tell children, shh. It's not that you can't say anything. No, don't raise your hand. Shh. It's not like, oh, you're in church and you can't talk. It's the idea of be calm. Stop. Everything's going to be fine. You need to be restful, at peace, relaxed, quiet, because everything's okay. This is Moses' response. So what happens? Here Moses, in this incredibly tense and painful scenario, where I personally would have washed my hands, thrown up, and walked away, Moses says, don't be afraid. You just need to be still, be quiet, trust God. He's going to work. He's got a plan. He's going to save you. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to break camp. As for you, lift up your staff, stretch it out over the sea, and divide it so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I am going to harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh, all his army, and his chariots and horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh when I receive glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Then the angel of God, who was going in front of the Israelite forces, moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and stood behind them, and it came between the Egyptian and Israelite forces. The cloud was there in the darkness, yet it lit up the night, so neither group came near the other all night long. Why didn't God just part the Red Sea just like that? He could have. But it says that the cloud stood between them all night long. Why didn't God just make it? He did work a miracle, didn't he? It was phenomenal, wasn't it? Why didn't he do it just like this? Because God wants us to keep trusting him. Because God doesn't need to do things based on our emotional comfort at that moment. He does do things for our emotional comfort. I said he doesn't need to. Clarify. All right? He doesn't need to. So then what happens? Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. I tell you what, isn't that great? God still wants to use the willing servants. So God says to Moses, stretch your hand out over the sea. Moses stretches his hand out over the sea. Guys, God's going to save you. Watch this. What you doing, Moses? Watch. Moses, I don't see anything. Watch. Moses, the Egyptian army's still there. Moses, you going to put your arm down now and tell us what to do? You know, I heard a funny story. A kid comes back from Sunday school, and his mom says, what did you learn in Sunday school, son? He says, oh, Mom, we learned how the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. And she says, oh, well, tell me about it. He says, well, there was this army behind them, and they were kind of scared for their life. So they got the Army Corps of Engineers together. They built a flotation bridge across the Red Sea, and the whole nation crossed. But when the Egyptians tried to cross, they blew up the bridge, and they sank to the bottom of the sea. And his mom said, son, I know that's not how it happened, but why are you telling me that? He says, because, Mom, if I told you what my teacher told me, you wouldn't believe it either. Imagine being an adult watching Moses as you got an army's behind you, and Moses has told you to relax and watch God's salvation. And what does Moses do? He holds up his hand over the water, and a strong wind starts to blow. Would you not wonder if the man had lost his mind? Would you not wonder if anything was going to happen? After all, we've all seen strong winds before, haven't we? We know what a big storm is like, don't we? Frankly, I don't see a strong wind blowing the Egyptian army away. It's just this guy holding his hand up over the water all night long as there's a strong wind. But suddenly, after all night long, the water seems to have really moved. And as the sun starts to come up and we're looking down, we actually see land where the water was yesterday. Is this just some weird freak accident of nature? But then I look, as I get closer to the edge of the water, I look, and it actually looks like there's kind of this built-up wall of water being held there by this wind that's still blowing. And I'm wondering, is this even possible? And Moses says, okay, we're going to cross. The only reason I would cross is because if I go backwards, I'm going to die. Right? I'm not crossing because I trust in God. I'm not crossing because I've seen a miracle. I'm crossing because I don't want to die. As a matter of fact, in just a couple weeks, I'm going to prove that I'm not trusting God because I'm going to create a golden idol that I'm going to start worshiping and having this massive thousand people orgy in front of this golden idol because Moses is stuck up on this mountain with this, once again, God that he claims that we're following. And frankly, I just don't see it. You know, Moses was simply a tool to show God's glory. Moses didn't bring everybody in Israel to salvation. Moses didn't bring everybody to faith. Moses didn't convince everybody that God was the God that they had to serve. Moses just carried God's message, and then God worked miraculously in incredible, mind-blowing ways. By faith they crossed the Red Sea as though they were on dry land. When the Egyptians attempted to do this, they were drowned. This incredible story is all about God and how incredible He is and how awesome He is. Moses was just a tool. Moses had, what was this? Moses had eyes of faith. He was able to see that God had something much greater, much bigger, much more awesome, much grander planned, even though Moses didn't know exactly what it was. As a matter of fact, what was it he said in Exodus just now? He says to stand still and to see the salvation of the Lord. Stop your panicking. Stop trying to figure out a solution. Just trust that God's going to work something out because that's who He is. God's going to take care of you because that's what He does. So what does this mean for you and I? It's rather simple. Are you being used as a tool by God? That's the question. Do you have eyes of faith, trusting that God will use you because that's who He is? Not because of who you are. Not because of what you bring to the table. It's just because you're willing to say yes. When everybody else is panicking, are you willing to say, you can calm down, you can stop trying to figure it out, you can trust God because He's working this out for your good? Right? Scripture says that, and we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. Right? We know this verse to be true, but frankly, when all of the nastiness in life comes together at the same time, do we have the faith to say, stand still and see what God is going to do? Look for His salvation. That's all Moses did. Moses was just a mouthpiece pointing to the glory of God. That's all he did. But frankly, personally, there have been many times in my life I didn't want to be the mouthpiece. I was not interested because being the mouthpiece meant no one was going to like what I had to say. Doesn't mean that it was bad. Doesn't mean that they wouldn't appreciate the end result of what God was going to do. But at the moment, no one wants to hear you say, stop worrying. Because frankly, there's every reason to worry. We're going to die. There's every reason to panic. What do you mean, stop worrying? What do you mean, stop trying to fix this? That doesn't make any sense at all. I know. I'm just saying, look to God because He's awesome. Trust in Him because He has a promise that He's going to take care of you. And He always fulfills His promises. He never reneges. He never goes back. He never fails. His promises are always true. And what's the response at the moment? Well, they haven't proven true to this point, have they? Isn't that the knee-jerk response in the middle of the pain? Isn't that it? For myself and for others, well, they haven't proven true to this point. So am I going to be the mouthpiece that says they're still true regardless of what you say and regardless of the circumstances that you see? That's all that Moses did. Moses was just the mouthpiece that in the middle of any circumstance, he said, you can still trust God. That's all he was doing. He was pointing back to God over and over and over again. And it didn't change right away. There was no quick solution. He was just pointing people back to God. And in the process, God used Moses to accomplish what we know as great things. But Moses didn't accomplish anything. God did all of it. Moses was just the mouthpiece saying, God's still faithful. God's still true. Are you going to be that mouthpiece? Are you going to be the one that says God is still faithful? God is still true? God hasn't changed? I hope that each one of us will be that mouthpiece, because there are people in each one of our lives that need to hear those words. People that today need to know you can stop worrying. You can stop being afraid. You can stop trying to solve all of these problems. You can stop trying to fix this whole situation, because God has a promise and He will fulfill it. And when we are that mouthpiece, we bring people hope. And not only do we bring them hope, we get their attention on God, and they start looking to see what He's going to do. You see, a whole nation saw God at work because Moses said, look to God. We can lead our friends, can't we? Our family. Look to God. Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for the power of your word. Thank you for the opportunity to trust you. I thank you for Moses. Lord, I thank you for using somebody just to be a tool in your hand. Lord, I pray that each one of us here would have the faith that today and this week we might simply be a tool pointing to the Messiah, saying that you are worth trusting. Like Moses, who counted the treasure of the Messiah greater value than all of the treasure of Egypt. Lord, may that be our hope, our joy, and our pursuit. That you are more valuable than anything else that we could possibly have in this life.